This is the second of two pre-recorded lectures on listening. The first dealt with, in general, the various types of listening. This one deals specifically with ineffective listening behaviors. You don't need to listen to the lectures in that order, but if you have a chance, you might want to look at the first one first. So looking at ineffective listening behaviors, one thing I can tell you is this is also in your book. All seven are listed in your book, though I may not be having you read that at this point, but you can certainly refer to it. So looking at ineffective listening, there are different types of ineffective listening behaviors. The first is what is called pseudo-listening. We all know what pseudo-listening is. It's when you pretend to listen, pseudo meaning pretend, when you pretend to listen. So it's nodding, establishing eye contact, smiling, doing the things to make the person feel like they're being listened to when your mind is miles and miles away. The second kind of ineffective listening behavior is what's called stage hogging. And stage hogging is when you're listening really to assert your own agenda or your own story. So many times people will listen to someone talk about something and then they'll say, hey, the same thing happened to me. And then they launch into a story. Now, in some instances, that's fine to do because that could also be called empathetic or empathic listening when you try to identify with somebody. But when you simply are listening so that the story can become about you with your story, then that would be called stage hogging. And usually it's involved, interruption is involved in stage hogging. The third ineffective listening behavior is what's called ambushing. And ambushing is simply when you're listening to attack. So as it sounds, as an ambush would be, you're simply lying in wait until someone says something that then trips them up and then you can pounce on it. And if you think about it, you might have had these kind of situations happen in your life at some point in time. All of these you've probably had happen in your life at some point in time, but you might want to reflect on those as I go through this discussion. The fourth type of ineffective listening is what's called selective listening, and that's when we listen to only the part that interests us. It's also known as biased listening, but essentially we listen only to the parts that are interesting, or we listen to the parts that would affect us. For example, if a student in class is not really listening, but then they hear the word extra credit, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I should probably find out what that is. Or alternately, if they're listening to a lecture and then an instructor says something like, this will be on a quiz, and all of a sudden a person jumps to attention, that would be selective listening. The fifth kind of ineffective listening behavior is what's called insulated listening, and that is when you are avoiding specific information, that you simply refuse to hear it or you make an excuse that you haven't heard it, but it's basically failure to acknowledge part of an issue or an entire issue that someone talked about, in which case a person's response would probably be, well, I didn't hear that. You didn't tell me that, is usually insulated listening. Now, it also may be that they actually didn't listen very well, but if you consciously sort of avoid the things that are uncomfortable for you to listen to, then that would be considered insulated listening. The sixth is what's called defensive listening, which is when you're listening and you start taking remarks as personal. So if someone is talking about something, you say, well, I didn't do that. Or they make a comment about something and you say, well, I don't think that's very nice. And so all of a sudden the remarks are all about you. That's what defensive listening is about. And we'll talk about this more when we get to conflict resolution, because obviously part of resolving conflict is the ability to listen well. And then finally, the last type of ineffective listening behavior is what's called insensitive listening. And this is when you respond to superficial things and not to the substance of the thing. So if a person, if they were trying to describe something to you or discuss something with you and they misspoke, they used a different word, and then all of a sudden you say, well, oh, you said that word, and it's like, well, I didn't mean that word. Well, that's the word you said. That would be insensitive listening, when you're listening to small little things and you're sort of missing the larger picture, which is the emotional content that is being expressed by the words that are chosen. So simply kind of stopping a person from, I mean, part of it is that you are only listening to superficial information, but the other part is you're sort of negating the emotional content that's coming with the message. So if a person's really angry, and you don't acknowledge that, if you don't say, I'm sensing that you're angry, or I'm sorry that you're angry, that might be thought that you're listening insensitively if you only respond to the content but not to the fact that a person's really upset or that a person is really excited. So these are the 7 ineffective listening behaviors. Like I said, your book has these in print verbatim. Couple of questions you might want to ponder as we move into class, and that would be, what style or styles do you use most often? Do you find yourself, being a defensive listener? Do you find yourself being sort of a pseudo listener? And then probably the follow-up question to this is, in what situations do you use these kinds of styles? So do you find, for example, that you use pseudo listening when you're talking to a certain person? Or do you use pseudo listening when it's a time of day? For example, at the end of the day, if you've had a long day with Zoom classes and work and other commitments, then it might be at the end of the day you're kind of tired of listening, but you don't want to be rude, so you're sort of listening, not listening. Maybe it's time of day that's causing that. Maybe it's this particular subject matter. I think we are all very defensive about certain subject matters, not as defensive about other ones. So are there certain subjects that kind of trigger you to respond in a less than ideal way? Uh, what else? And also the people that are involved. There are certainly people in our lives where we can listen very openly, and then there's other people where we always feel slightly guarded, or I need to be on edge because of my relationship with this person. And then finally, the last question to ponder is, what kind of responses do you get? What kind of responses do you get when you pretend to listen? Can somebody spot that, or do they seem oblivious? And certainly with cell phones, that would be a really good question to ask yourself, is when you get a response, when someone says, could you not talk on your phone? And you say, well, I'm listening. It's like they already know that you're not fully listening, you're not fully engaged. So there we go. 7 ineffective listening behaviors. You want to try to minimize those. And I think as we move forward in class, you will find ways to do that. And that will be something that we actually talk about in class. So this is, as I said, the second of 2 lectures.